Hi there, so for my journal entry today, I'm going to be talking about tests and testing. And some of my ideas kind of derive from when in class we've kind of briefly gone over a little bit in Socratic seminars, a little bit about tests and testing, and we've read a little bit about tests and testing in some of the chapters, or it was briefly mentioned in some of the chapters in the book by Philip Jackson, Life in Classrooms. So those are kind of where my ideas came from and how I can kind of relate my journal entry to what I'm speaking on today. So I guess when I think of tests and testing, the first question that kind of comes to my mind is, why do we test? Or who came up with this idea of formally assessing students as an accurate means of showing what students know? And I can't answer that question myself, but I don't know where testing originated from, but I do know that testing in some degree is important because as educators or as future educators, it is important to know what your students know. And to know what your students know, you have to have some type of assessment, whether that be formal or informal. But my question more so is, how do we assess students in an accurate way that really truly shows what they know, rather than just seeing what they've memorized, or if maybe they possibly could have cheated, or maybe that if they do bomb a test, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't know the material. Maybe that the format of the testing or the format of the test was written in such a way that the student couldn't learn that way. So how do we know that our students know something is kind of my opening question. And then my follow-up question would be, how can we reform the testing system to fit in such a way that we can teach our students what they need to know, and that they can accurately show that they have retained and understand this information. So kind of going off of that, as a young kid, I've struggled, well, not even just as a young kid, even now, I still struggle with taking tests. In elementary school, I had severe test anxiety. I remember I had to get special testing extensions for math tests and stuff. I remember in middle school, I had to go to the office and be in a quiet area, so I had special testing accommodations, because I would get so easily distracted. If I saw somebody finishing a test before me, it would give me severe anxiety, and then I would try to rush through the test. And even in college, in lecture classes, when I would have to take lecture-based tests, I would get severe anxiety when everyone in the room starts getting up and turning in their exams, because then it's just loud, and then the environment for testing just makes the environment terrible, and I can't focus and whatnot. And even now, even now, I'm stressed about taking my praxis exam. And even in high school, I was so stressed about having to take the ACT and the SAT. And I didn't do well on either one of those. And it kind of makes me wonder, did I not know the material, or was the way I was being assessed, did that accurately display what I actually knew? So kind of going off of that, I guess the biggest thing that I have a problem with in terms of testing is standardized testing. I certainly believe that there needs to be some form of assessment, because how, as educators, do we know what our students know, and how do we know what to teach or how to move onward if we don't have an accurate way of showing what our students know? So in order to know what to teach, we must do some type of assessment. But I think the reason why I have such a problem with standardized testing is because the state is saying students need to know one thing, whereas or the state or the government is saying students need to know one thing, whereas teachers themselves are having to prepare their students for a test that they don't even necessarily know what's on it, A, and B, this test is a one-size-fits-all test. All students have to take this test. It doesn't matter how they learn best. It doesn't matter how they learned all year. Everyone at the end of the year has to take this same test. And my question is that necessarily a good thing? I kind of think that the idea of standardized testing is actually a pretty terrible idea, because if you think about it, it's a uniform test. You would think that it's a good way of measuring what students know. But in actuality, you're just comparing data of what students know to other students in the state. And I don't think that's an accurate way of defining the importance of what students know. And so I think testing should be more so based off an individual classroom. Something I've learned and something that I think I'll continue to see is that every classroom is different. Every student is different. And so to say that all students have to learn in a certain way and to say all students have to test in a certain way is completely silly to me, because everyone on planet Earth is so different. You're going to go into a classroom and you're going to see kids that come from so many different backgrounds. You're going to see kids that come from low-income families where they come off from well-off families. Or you're going to see kids that have had access to books. You're going to see kids that have not had access to books. You're going to see kids that that read constantly. You're going to see kids that do extracurricular activities. You're going to see kids that have quote-unquote learning disabilities. You're going to see kids of all different shapes and sizes, all different backgrounds, and that makes a classroom environment very different. So each classroom or class is different, and then on top of it, each student in that class is different. So to make one uniform test for every single student in the state is absurd to me. And again, the people making the test are government officials who, I hate to say it, have probably rarely ever walked foot into a classroom. And my question is, how can they make a test for students if they aren't the ones walking and stepping foot in the classroom? They're not the ones getting to know the students and knowing seeing what they know, or how intelligent these students actually are. So my idea is kind of to get rid of this whole idea of standardized testing. I think standardized testing should be done away with. And obviously that's going to take a really long time, but the whole idea of standardized testing is terrible to me. First off, it's not good for the students. Students get test anxiety from them. There's nothing that great that comes out of them. It doesn't accurately portray what students actually know, because the wording on these standardized testing is often very different from the way the kids are being assessed all year. So if a student is being asked questions all year long one way, and then they get to the exam and they've known all the material the whole year, and they get to the exam and then they bomb it, then does that mean they don't know it? Being asked something in a different way it's hard for me to explain, but I just think that standardized testing should be done away with. Because not only is it not good for the students, for teachers are so consumed in this idea of making sure their students do well on standardized testing. They want their students to get 3s and 4s on the EOGs rather than 1s and 2s, or 3s and 4s on EOCs, or whatever the test might be. They're so consumed in making sure their students do well because their jobs are put at risk if their students don't perform well on these tests. Whereas they're spending so much time focusing on that rather than the individual needs in their classrooms. And that's something that I think needs to be done away with. So I think this idea of standardized testing needs to go. And then you might be asking, like, well, what kind of testing should we do? How do we know what our students know? How should students be assessed? And I think this kind of goes to the idea that teachers should kind of have the ability to make tests to fit the individual needs of their classrooms. I think test formats should be kind of altered to show for individual students. Maybe one student could do a video like this and talk for 10 or 15 minutes on a subject area and prove that they know the information. But maybe for another kid, that would not be the way that they should be assessed. Maybe for another student, they need to write a paper. Or maybe for another student, they need to do a project that shows that they can display the knowledge. I think application-based assessments are a great way of showing whether or not students learn. Instead of just preparing for a test that just they write down A, B, C, D, that's just something that I think needs to be changed. So I think at the end of the day, my points are that standardized testing needs to be done away with, because I don't think it does any good for students and I don't think it does any good for teachers. And then B, I think that teachers should have more control over testing in their classroom. I think teachers should be able to make testing so that their students, it fits their students' individual needs, whether that be testing like if each student has their own individual method of testing, I don't know, but I just know that every student's different and people are going to show and display knowledge in different ways, or display that their understanding of knowledge in different ways. So that's kind of my big takeaway. And this doesn't really necessarily have to do with tests or testing, but last semester in one of my classes, we watched a video on this on the teaching channel of this teacher who had like a unit on, it was like a 4th grade class, I think, and they did a unit on poetry. And so she allowed the students to choose, like, they could either like write a poem, they could like speak it, or they could like make it to music. And there was like all these different formats and ways that these students could display like their understanding of the unit of poetry. And so I think that's what would be like a really cool way to incorporate into testing to show like whether or not students know the material, is to like incorporate many different ways of assessment. Because for one kid, they might know something, and the other kid might know the same thing, but they might not be able to show it in the same way. One kid might be able to write about it, and one kid might be able to speak about it. But do they both know the same thing? Arguably, yes, they do. It's just, I think it's not necessarily about do students know the material. I think it's more so about how they can show that they know the material. So that's just kind of my little spiel about testing. To sum up, I really think that standardized testing needs to be done away with, and I think teachers should have more control in the classrooms over what they want to assess their students on, and in what ways they should assess their students. There should be probably formal testing should be more so formal testing should be more so based on the teacher. It shouldn't be up to the state. The teacher should be able to come up with mechanisms or testing methods that work for her individual students or his individual students. So thank you for listening to my journal. I hope you have a great day.